Hello and welcome to Buildings of Tomorrow. My name is John Lester, and in today's episode, we are talking about decarbonising infrastructure. Such an important topic for us to really try and achieve the goals that we have as a society and really reach these sustainability goals and challenge climate change that is giving us so many different challenges across our organisation, across our industry, across our society. And I'm really happy and excited today. I'm joined by Oliver Tsai. He is the project lead for net zero carbon cities at the World Economic Forum. Oliver, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And before we jump into the conversation about decarbonising infrastructure and really talking about what you and your team does on a daily basis and the cool conversations that you have out there in the industry, maybe give us a quick summary. What do you do and your team do, and where do you focus in your work that you do at the forum?
Yeah. So the mission of the forum's Net Zero Carbon Cities program is to really create the enabling environment to help advance clean electrification and circularity. Both of which are key levers to reducing emissions in the urban landscape. And we do this by promoting an integrated approach, across the different elements of the urban ecosystem, looking at the intersection of mobility, built environment, and energy services. And we work with our stakeholders in a collaborative fashion, bringing together government, private industry, and civil society. So really trying to take that holistic approach to engage everybody.
Yeah, perfect. A really interesting topic. I can't imagine the kind of conversations that you and your team would have. Some of the really cool, projects and different topics that you work on. But no, I'm really excited for this conversation today because, as you mentioned, you look at the holistic picture. You look at the circularity and have that ultimate goal of net zero cities. And of course, a big part of that is the built environment. You mentioned that as part of your scope, and that's a little bit where we want to focus today. Maybe the first question: how important is the built environment for this holistic vision? How important is the built environment to really achieving those sustainability goals?
I think that the built environment is definitely critically important to the climate challenge, to decarbonization. And I think to be a little bit more specific, it's the urban built environment. Even more so. I'll start off with a couple of statistics. Don't want to bore your audience. I'm sure they're all very well versed in the figures, but we're seeing that urban ecosystems, cities, create 70% of global emissions, and then among that, built environment, buildings, they generate 38% of carbon emissions. So it's definitely a huge challenge, and I think the other thing to consider is the massive scale of built environment, what we interact with through our daily lives, As urbanization continues, as our cities and population continue to grow, it's driving additional construction worldwide. It's something that's really massive, and I think it's something that we need to be able to intervene and get right rather quickly.
Yeah, perfect. And love the clarification. Thanks, because when we really do look at the urban built environment, I think that's a really important differentiation because, as you say, urbanization is growing. Population is growing, and the demand for space, exactly like you described in that last topic, within these cities, within these urban centres, or these constructs, is growing at an extremely fast rate. And let's say we understand that we already have a challenge. So we have this driver, urbanization, the demand for space and energy and infrastructure within an urban environment is growing. We also know that we're somehow already behind in this race. We have to not just reduce emissions, reduce our consumption of different energy sources, etc., but also go beyond that and start to really wind back some of the challenges that we have to tackle this topic. And at times, sometimes this is referred to as a race. Somehow we're behind in the race, and to catch up and then eventually win, we have to speed up and we have to get moving. And before we dive into sort of how do we do that and the conversations you have, I want to touch quickly, without deep diving into technology, and have a look at or get your impression around digitalization. Um, Urban centers, different systems, electrification, mobility, and electrical mobility you talked about, the built environment, etc. How important is that digitalization aspect and the ability to build those ecosystems across this built environment?
I think digitalization is really going to be very critical to being able to achieve the success that we need at the scale that we need it to come at. And I think that sure, individual buildings, they can implement isolated solutions, that works just for them. But I think that the connective tissue that is going to link that particular system with all the other buildings around, in the city network, that's going to be data, and that's going to be digital tools. So I think in that respect, it's absolutely going to be a really critical kind of central part of the solution moving forward.
Perfect. Hey, we'll come back to that at some point because I don't want to talk about the solution yet because I'm really interested also to understand a little bit the problem. And here I want to link just quickly to a report that Siemens is an organisation. They've been working on this quite a little bit and talking with key customers, talking with key members in the industry. And one of the topics that really came out of this report, it was called the new space race, and it's something that I'll refer to at the end. But one of the topics that really came out, especially when we talk to owners, investors, managers, users of this built environment, was around adaptability. And here is where I'd like to make that link between the drivers that you talked about earlier, between digitalization, and just talk about adaptability and understanding how how can we and what's the approach that we can take uh, in in the stakeholder groups, in the organizations, the governments, the municipalities that you talk to bring in that adaptability side of things. How is that possible, and what are the kinds of conversations that you have that help drive that topic?
Adaptability, I think it can mean a couple of different things on different levels. So I personally come from the engineering sector where I used to work as a civil engineer. So, to me, it's something that's very physical. It's a very tangible kind of concept. I think that, at a higher level, when we're talking about systems, there's the adaptability from a technology standpoint, and I think that's, as we alluded to, is going to become increasingly important. But, I think as far as buildings go, the way that business is conducted now, the way that we interact with buildings, adaptability and adaptable use, I think that's been probably talked about for a number of years now. And it's definitely become increasingly important, following the dramatic changes that we've all experienced as the world population in the past couple of years. I think that following pandemic, I've personally still been working from home a number of days a week, and I think that we're all figuring out what impacts it's going to have with lifestyle and kind of working models. And I think that we're still seeing that push and pull from both government and private sector employers on what kind of standards that we should be expecting in the future, right? So, the term new normal's been like used probably too much in the past 2 years, but I don't think we still really know what that means yet.
Yeah,
Um,
I love that last quote because I think you're right. The thing is that fast forward 5 years, 10 years, we're probably not going to have as much more of a clue that we do today as we did 5 or 10 years ago. No one could have imagined we'd find ourselves in this situation with the requirements, the expectations, and the usability of spaces within the built environment that we see today. And I can imagine that 5 years in or 10 years in the future, we'll find ourselves in a similar situation with use cases and expectations which don't really fit even this new normal that you talk about. I think that's probably that point. The new normal, if we talk about it in any situation, it evolves as we go. How how do you tackle that conversation? When you're out there talking with governments, out there talking with private companies and corporations, etc. What does that conversation look like or sound like when you can't really predict what the use cases, the expectations, or the applications will be?
mhm. I mean, I think that a big factor there is about risk, right? It's the uncertainty and risk that comes with what decisions that a an asset owner or an investor is willing to take with their building or their asset. And I've been thinking about why it's been so difficult to implement that type of adaptability. since it's already been in the conversation for some time, like even preceding pandemic. I think that part of it is regulations. Like when you talk with government and you talk about talk to cities about regulations, this is kind of tapping back into the my prior experience as an engineer, but building codes have been written very specific ways for specific occupancy types. And most of the designs and construction that you have in existing buildings, they're primarily created for fairly specific applications. And, when you talk about that kind of physical asset, that kind of physical presence, there's a lot of hardwired stuff, a lot of hardwired equipment, HVAC, ventilation, got your electrical conduits, water piping, steam and gas lines. And I mean, all of those things, I think, if they weren't originally designed in a way that is suitable for adaptive use, it becomes really challenging and costly to make a retrofit out of that to totally change your application of a space. So yeah, I think that's what I've heard in conversations with people who are very close to operational level. But I think I'll drop in a brief anecdote that may or may not be relevant. But I think that it seems to me that engineers from 100 years ago seem to have a great deal of foresight on what they needed to put together in their heavy infrastructure, from water aqueducts to the tunnels that the subway systems use, and they seem to have planned in quite a bit of extra redundancy or extra flexibility for people down the line to adapt. And I think that that's something that along the way, whether it's from the economic models or the margins that businesses increasingly have to deal with, or governments for that matter, I think that the advanced planning, it seems to have changed. I don't want to say that we don't do it anymore, but it does feel like the type of planning seems to have shifted a bit.
Yeah, I understand. I think that's a great anecdote and definitely on point because, as you mentioned, if you don't think about that, or at least enable and build in the capability for the flexibility, you do limit yourself at some point in the future, and that could offset any of the economic benefits you might find in the short term by picking a simpler solution or a different operating technology. We opened a lot of doors there. We talked a bit about digitalization. We talked about adaptability. We're now talking about, kind of, what is the what are some of the drivers that maybe find ourselves in a situation, etc. I wanted to bring it all together because one of the things that we've talked about in preparation for this conversation, but also you're out there with your team talking about in the industry, is kind of building a little bit of a framework, bringing a little bit of a structure to this very broad and complex conversation. When you talk about the whole city, when you talk about the future, the adaptability, the requirement to drive towards net zero, and the multitude of different systems that are interacting and interplaying together to get to that point, you can't just have an open discussion, right? Like you'll never find solutions, and you'll never find cases for action. So maybe you could give us a little bit of an insight into that framework that you work on and that you've developed at the forum, and how that drives your conversation, and also how it brings some of these different stakeholders together, and helps push that mindset back towards where we need to be to achieve these goals.
Sure. Before I get into that, I think just to close the loop on the last point, I think that didn't mean to shortchange anybody who's actively working, in the space. There are a lot of smart people out there, working in architecture, engineering, design, real estate, and urban design that are thinking about what types of systems we need in the future. So I think that definitely have to recognize the good work that's being done in the sector there.
Yeah, that's, and I'll jump in there as well. I think one of the most exciting things, and one of the reasons that we're kind of having this conversation, is that if we look back, at least at the built environment, and here's the industry where I live and work every day. If we look at that industry, it's traditionally quite slow moving, but the level of excitement, the level of innovation, the level of application of new technologies is just hitting an absolute fever pitch at the moment, and it's such a cool time because so many new things are coming, and so many of the lines that used to sit between different technologies, different industries, and what was IT and what was OT and what was electrical and what was not, etc. These lines are blurring, and it's such an exciting and cool time at the moment because I think we're now technologically, but also, like you talked about, we have amazingly smart people who are starting to blur those lines and make these connections, which make this kind of conversation possible. If we wanted to sit down 15 years ago, it may have been more difficult. But now I think, like you described, those innovators and those really pushing the boundaries in all of the industries that make up this complete picture are the ones that are kind of getting us to the point where we can really take action. And I think that's one of the really exciting parts.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that we just got back from the heels of the annual meeting at Davos a couple of weeks ago, and what you're mentioning brings to mind something that I'd heard that really points to the sense of scale and urgency that we have on this issue right now. And we had a number of meetings on energy transition and the transformation that's needed for infrastructure and built environment, in order to support that target for the climate goals. And one sentiment that really captured it well was that we need that transformation to happen at the scale of the industrial revolution, but at the pace of the digital revolution. And so, I think that I think what you just said, reminded me of that comment.
Yeah, and that brings back to where we started a little bit as well. We started to talk about a race and speed.
Hmm.
Speed is
Hmm.
certainly a topic I'd like to talk about towards the end of our conversation today, because all of the skills, all of the technology, all of the good intentions, and let's say setting ourselves clear goals and aspirations. Those clear goals and aspirations are by no means easy for us to achieve. And here I talk about things like net zero, things like the European Green Deal, and the many different regulations and directives that are being generated across the globe, or down to a corporation level, saying that individual corporations wish to be net zero or reduce their emissions. So there are just so many moving parts, and it's a challenge in general to not only achieve this complex outcome, but also with the speed that you just described. It's a great way to say the industrial revolution, as far as a seismic shift in technology and application at the speed of the digital revolution, is going to keep us busy. Let's say it at
Yeah,
least
yeah, we've got
from
our
that
hands full.
perspective. Yeah, definitely. So let me come back to you again, because I know your team, you use this framework, and I'll leave it to you to quote the name exactly, but I think it's the Net Zero Carbon Cities Building Value Framework.
Hmm.
I'll pass that back to you to give us a bit of an insight. What is it? What do you use it for? And how does it help you structure that and bring forward momentum to these complex conversations?
Yeah, yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. And I think where it started was really, we started off speaking with a lot of the the forum's partners, the stakeholders in the building value chain, and that ranges all from the engineers, the constructors, technology providers, such as Siemens, to investors and real estate developers. And we were speaking with cities as well, and just trying to get a sense for. Well, we know that this decarbonization has to happen. We know that buildings need to become more efficient. They need to, there's a huge global push for green buildings, and so the need is there, the demand is there. So the question then became, well, why isn't it happening as quickly as we want it to be? And I think that I forget what the exact figure was. I think it's maybe like 1.5% of buildings in the US are green buildings. When you look globally, that's less than 1% of all the buildings in the world. So, it became, just a challenge of identifying what the barriers for driving those investments to the right projects were. And through those conversations, we had arrived at insight that it was really the decision makers that are really critical are the asset owners. Whether it's government or private sector, as well as the investors that are able to kind of channel the financing, channel the investment and funds to these projects. So we ended up looking at, well, what's the decision calculus here? And I think for a lot of asset owners, building owners, they tend to have a shorter term decision horizon. I think
Mhm.
that they typically look for a certain amount of return on investment within a 5 to 7 year window. But the operation and lifespan of a building is it spans decades. If not more. If you design it right. So it then became a challenge of trying to help align those two time frames and trying to shift the mindset of looking at decisions based purely on cost and profit over to more of a decision where you look at value and like talking about holistic value, where some of the the externalities of better social value, environmental value for the users and tenants, become embedded in the decisions.
Yeah, I understand. And maybe give us because you mentioned there a couple of different aspects: the emissions, the value for the people using the building. You still have that consideration around return on investment, but have to take a different time span beyond just that standalone. So, what are some of the aspects that you use to help kind of that conversation, to help that decision making process?
So the framework itself, it covers, it tries to link and link in a holistic way. I think it's really challenging to really make a quantitative correlation of if you put X investment into your building to if you let's just use solar panels as an example. If you put X amount in solar panels, you'll get Y return on investment. I think you'll get some in terms of operational opex reductions from energy savings, but I think looking at things in a even more broader kind of perspective can kind of reveal certain values that weren't necessarily apparent before. So I think going back into the framework, we look at things from asset outcomes, linking it to kind of more system based outcomes. But we were covering 5 categories, looking at emissions reductions, including embodied carbon, operational carbon, looking at environmental improvements, whether that's through water usage, minimizing waste, enhancing biodiversity. Let's see, the third element would be looking at user satisfaction. That's really the human element of how does your investment in these solutions helping to improve the health, well-being, and productivity of your occupants, of your clients and tenants. And then, I think kind of trending more into the system outcomes at a city or district level. You have your systemic efficiencies, where some of the digital tools can help to unlock, further flexibility and interconnectivity of your systems. And then finally, there's the socioeconomic standpoint of it, where making these kind of improvements can help create jobs and it can help lower energy costs for the consumers.
Yeah, I understand. That's a huge amount of scope, and most of the topics that you mentioned there really do go beyond that simple return on investment conversation. It goes beyond, especially you mentioned one there, the systemic value efficiency, going beyond that individual standalone asset and starting to talk at a community level, starting to talk at a city level, and really understanding the interactions and the additional values or the the draw or the reduction of value depending on how that building or that asset starts to operate within its broader scope. Um, such an interesting conversation when you start to go to that level. I can imagine that there's a lot of really good, in-depth but challenging conversations that go through when you walk through this framework with different cities, communities, companies. Let's link a little bit back to that digitalization topic, because across several of those different aspects that you just mentioned, the scope of the framework that you've built, digitalization and different technologies are core enablers there. So how, pick, maybe you could pick for us a couple, one or two examples within that framework, specific topics where the technology really, and maybe the technology today really enables us to take action which we couldn't take in the past.
Hmm. Um,
It's a tough
you
one,
know,
right?
yeah, I mean, it's a complex question. So let me take a moment to kind of reflect on that. Um, it brings to mind a couple of the case studies that we performed. Through developing the framework, and one of them was the case municipality in Italy, northern Italy, called San Mauro Torinese. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it was a project that was led by one of our partners, NLX. And they're a smart energy service provider based in Italy with global operations. But they helped the government in a public-private partnership to decarbonize their buildings and retrofit and digitalize their building portfolio. I think it was about 30 or 32 buildings overall. I think that what we started to talk about earlier on, where any individual building can implement something like they can put their solar panels on the roof, they can change to LED lighting, switch their heating systems to a more efficient system. But I think that the interconnectivity of it really relies on those digital tools, to enable that IoT system and platform for things to run more effectively and run more efficiently. And I think you could probably talk more detail about it than I could. But I think from that particular case study, they set up a lot of monitoring devices and sensors to help connect those different systems. And the main objectives were to help reduce the city's operating expenses and increase energy efficiency. But I think that it, after they implemented all of these tools, it enabled the city's building managers to really work a lot more effectively, and it improved service levels for the public, the users, customers of these government offices, and it freed up the asset management agencies to be able to devote more resources on priority maintenance, rather than kind of manually having to oversee the operation of every single system separately.
Yeah, I understand. And I think it's a great example because exactly what you described, I think, is core to the conversation about what can we achieve when we start to look beyond an individual building, an individual asset, or even an individual discipline within a building. If you want to realize those benefits, like you just described, better service for the people using the buildings, a clearer idea of what's happening where, finding efficiencies in some of the traditional service activities that can then be redeployed to deliver even better savings, better service, or even be used to help deploy additional technologies. It's that combination, it's the perspective, but also the planning and the understanding of all the key stakeholders across that group and the collaboration which enables that. And your example is the perfect one because it talks a little bit, there's a lot of sensors, there's a lot of transparency and data that you need to collect, but then it's that understanding and the implementation across the different stakeholders, understanding what we do with it, how, which is essential to this. And without that, we've got a cloud full of stuff, but no real benefits to show from it.
Right, right. And I think that one of the keys is figuring out what to do with that data. The data is only as good as the people working with it, the systems that you use, to base your decisions on it. So I think going beyond digital tools, I think the infrastructure sector in general just would benefit from having a more. I think as you said, it's rapidly improving. We're catching up, but there's still a lot of work to do to be able to figure out how data can help unlock the full potential of this kind of systems management.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the perfect segue that brings us back to, and we promised we'd talk about it at the start, and then we talk about speed. We talk about this race, and we talk about, you mentioned before, if we look at the industry today, 1.5% of buildings are green buildings in the US, less than 1% globally. We know that we have to have significant progress here in this space if we want to realize the goals that we have to realize. We don't have an option here. It's very clear. I think that to reach our sustainability goals is not really an optional thing. It's something that we need to do as a society if we want to continue to enjoy the life that many of us take for granted. And I'd like to then ask you a little bit about speed, because you mentioned there that the different stakeholders, the understanding of what to do with the data, the digitalization is the core enabler. What what are the next steps? And here, I'm interested just in your initial impression. Like, what are some of the things we can do, and what are some of the enablers or the different mindsets that we need to adapt to as an industry, as a society, to start to really get that speed benefit and start to speed up?
Hmm. um, this is it feels like this is a perennial issue, right? We've as an industry, we're always trying to think about how we can catch up, to the digital age, and it's been a challenge, I think, broadly for infrastructure. And there's a lot of different reasons for it, like the long kind of lifespan of the infrastructure asset. What our decisions do now are going to influence. It's going to stick around and influence generations to come. So I think at least with kind of heavy public infrastructure, with governments, as the main client, that is, has its own set of challenges, in terms of aligning incentives along the life cycle, along the value chain, so that the people building it are going to have the incentive to embed the tools that are going to make it easier for the people operating it. So that's one of the conversations that we've had in a running series at the forum. I'd like to also kind of make a callback to an earlier forum initiative where we had published a white paper last summer on called Infrastructure 4.0, and in it, we had made it was broadly looking at the infrastructure sector, and precisely trying to answer, how can we speed this up, and how can we, you know, accelerate the adoption of these types of tools. And in it, we made some recommendations for public sector, private sector, civil society, around different kind of bucket categories, to create the new ecosystems that will enable this kind of forward thinking throughout the value chain. It's not enough for one person in a company or a team in a company, but it's really got to permeate through the culture of all the stakeholders involved. And creating new business models to be able to enable those types of exchanges of both data, information, and just the honestly the financial transactions that are needed to kind of enable this, through the delivery of a project. And I think the last thing is really, it's kept coming up recently, is having the skills and the educated workforce in order to deliver this. I think that in a lot of parts of the world, there's been a drain, I think, of technical experts that and we really need to build up that, not just in the students that are coming up, but really changing the mindset of people who are already in decision making positions, in their respective organizations. So, there's a big piece of that kind of skills building and kind of upskilling for the digital age that needs to happen.
Yeah, a really great summary, and I know it was a difficult question. I think you did exceptionally well there, because you hit on some really core topics. You mentioned right there that mindset, that innovation mindset, the understanding of the challenges of, let's say, the melding of the skills from a more traditional domain expertise to also understand the technology and finding that middle group. We can't have everyone that just understands the technology but have lost the domain skill and vice versa. You also talked about that. Let's call it the ecosystem, the conversation across all of the different stakeholders, etc. That collaboration and that forward thinking model. And I think at the start you mentioned incentives, and here I guess this also links back to regulation and government driven incentive schemes, investment schemes to help, let's say, make that conversation or that calculation around return on investment and all the rest of it a little bit easier for those corporations that are doing that sum in the back of their mind. So a great approach, and you know, we're close to the end, but before we get there, thanks so much, Oliver. It's a really great conversation. It was really much appreciated. So thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks so much, John. It's been a real pleasure to be here chatting with you. It's very interesting stuff, and I think it sets up the conversation for other topics, that we can definitely explore together.
Absolutely. And hey, I want to set up the conversation with my last question because you mentioned a couple of different things. We talked about the framework that you and your organizer work on, this net zero carbon cities building value framework. You also mentioned your infrastructure 4.0 white paper. I'm interested. What's next? What's next for the forum? What's next for you and the team that are working on this topic? And what's coming around the corner around this space?
Well, I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff coming up, and the work that we did on the building value, that was as part of a sector specific deep dive looking at built environment. But as I mentioned at the intro, the net zero carbon cities program, it's really the objective is to look at that intersection between the all the major systems, mobility, built environment, energy. And, we're continuing our work to try to localize net zero, to try to bring those solutions to the cities that are, actually implementing these. So, we've developed in the past year a digital toolbox of solutions, and that's an online platform that is contains over 200 examples of practical solutions, case studies, and best practices on electrification, efficiency, and smart infrastructure, and curated from around the world. And it's a living toolbox. It's a living database. So we invite Siemens, we invite others to help contribute to this. We're constantly looking out for other practices that can be adapted and scaled. That are ready to go, that others can put to work, in their cities. So that's something to keep an eye on. And there's a website that audience can check out. It's www.nzcc one word, .org.
Perfect. Hey, excited for that, and it's those kinds of toolboxes I think are important because as we've discussed throughout this, it's such a complex problem. There are so many moving parts, so many different systems, so many different disciplines and industries that all have to get involved. So the more we can learn from each other and also see what's successful in different places and leverage that, the more and more important. Oliver, thanks again. Much appreciated. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope it's not the last. I get the feeling we've got plenty more to chat about. If we had the opportunity, we could sit back and keep going. But for just today, thanks so much and your expertise and time. Much appreciated.
It's a pleasure chatting with you, John. Hope to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. And hey, for everyone out there listening, thank you also for joining us. Check out the World Economic Forum. You can look for the white paper that Oliver mentioned, Infrastructure 4.0. You can, I'm sure, also find some information around the net zero carbon cities building value framework. And I'm going to really test my memory here, but the NZCC dot. I'll let you do this one. Hit us with
Yep,
that URL again.
you got it. You got it. It's the nzcctoolbox.org.
Perfect. So check that out as well. And also take the opportunity, I mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation, but there is a paper, a report delivered from Siemens called The New Space Race. So if you Google Siemens, A New Space Race, it's also worth checking out to see some of the trends and let's call it the opportunities that we see within the built environment space, the infrastructure space, driven around adaptability, driven around expectations and requirements for users of built environments, and the expectations and the challenges we have coming up for all of us moving forward. But until then, please look out for those new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and always look out for our new episodes as they come every other week, or sometimes even more regularly, depending on how many exciting conversations we're lucky enough to have. But until the next time, we look forward for these future conversations. Oliver, we look forward to catching up with you again at some point in time. But until then, we'll see you very soon.